The shadow stands as perhaps the most challenging philosophical problem confronting the modern seeker of self-knowledge. It is not merely a psychological curiosity or a therapeutic concept to be intellectually understood and filed away. Rather, it represents the inevitable confrontation with that which we have most desperately sought to exclude from our conscious identity, the repository of everything we refuse to acknowledge as our own. This descent into the personal inferno constitutes the foundational crisis of authentic transformation, the threshold that separates genuine psychological work from the comfortable illusions of self-improvement culture. The historical lineage of shadow work extends far beyond the 20th century innovations of depth psychology. The ancient Hermetic maxim, as above so below, encoded within the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, established the principle that the macrocosm of the universe mirrors the microcosm of the individual soul. This understanding necessitated a comprehensive mapping of both celestial heights and infernal depths within the human psyche. The medieval alchemists, working in their laboratories with base metals and corrosive substances, understood their external operations as symbolic reflections of an interior process. Paracelsus, the radical Swiss physician alchemist of the 16th century, insisted that the true laboratory existed within the human being, and that the physician who had not descended into his own darkness could never heal the afflictions of others. Carl Gustav Jung, drawing upon this alchemical inheritance while simultaneously pioneering empirical psychology, articulated the shadow as the repository of repressed impulses, rejected aspects of personality, and undeveloped potentials that accumulate throughout life. His genius lay in recognizing that this personal unconscious material, far from being mere pathology to be eliminated, contained tremendous energy and possibility for growth. The Jungian project therefore demanded not the eradication of the shadow, but its conscious integration, a process he explicitly compared to the alchemical opus of transforming lead into gold. The esotericist Eliphas Levi, writing in the 19th century, understood that the magical will could only be forged through confrontation with one's internal demons. His doctrine of equilibrium insisted that the adept must achieve balance between opposing forces, not through their suppression, but through their conscious reconciliation. This is the true secret. Transformation is always an internal enterprise, a psychological and spiritual ordeal that cannot be bypassed through external rituals, substances, or techniques alone. The shadow work demands that the seeker abandon all comforting illusions about their own goodness, rationality, or spiritual advancement, and descend voluntarily into the chaos they have spent a lifetime trying to escape. The architecture of shadow integration rests upon a triadic structure that appears across multiple esoteric traditions, each articulating in its own symbolic language the fundamental pattern of descent, confrontation, and emergence. In alchemical terms, this manifests as the three primary principles: sulfur, the active, fiery, masculine principle of consciousness and will; mercury, the fluid, volatile, mediating principle of the psyche itself; and salt, the fixed, embodied, material principle of concrete experience. The shadow work specifically engages the mercurial function, the capacity of consciousness to flow between opposites, to hold tension without premature resolution, and to facilitate transformation through the alchemical marriage of incompatible elements. Within the Jungian framework, we encounter the quaternary structure of self, ego, persona, and shadow, forming a dynamic system of psychological forces. The persona represents the social mask, the adapted face we present to the world to secure belonging and approval. The ego designates the center of conscious awareness, the I that believes itself to be the totality of who we are. The shadow encompasses all that the ego has rejected to maintain its coherent identity and social acceptability. The self stands as the totality and telos, the organizing center of the entire personality, both conscious and unconscious, personal and transpersonal, the goal toward which the individuation process moves. This system connects intimately with the Kabbalistic tree of life, particularly the concept of the qliphoth, the shells or husks that represent the shadow side of each sephira on the tree. Just as the sephiroth represent emanations of divine light, the qliphoth represent their distorted, crystallized, or inverted forms. The descent into the shadow parallels the mystical descent through the qliphothic realms, where the adept must confront the demonic aspects of each divine quality. The sephira of Geburah, severity, strength, judgment, becomes, in its clifothic manifestation, cruelty and sadism. Chesed, mercy, compassion, abundance, inverts into indulgence and enabling codependency. This is not dualism. These are not separate forces battling for control, but rather aspects of the same energy in its healthy or pathological expression. The Neoplatonic tradition, particularly as articulated by Plotinus and later synthesized into Renaissance Hermeticism, conceived of reality as a series of emanations from the One. The soul's descent into matter represented both a fall from unity and a necessary journey for the sake of experience and eventual return. The Hermetic principle, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, encodes this entire movement. We must dissolve, solve, the rigid structures of ego identity, including the comfortable self-image we have constructed. We must descend into the fluid, chaotic, undifferentiated psychological material that we have repressed. Only then can we coagulate, coagula, a new, more comprehensive identity that includes rather than excludes the shadow material. The Rosicrucian tradition, particularly as expressed in texts like the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, dramatized this process through symbolic narrative. The protagonist must undergo trials, descend into darkness, witness disturbing transformations, and sacrifice his previous understanding of himself before achieving illumination and rebirth. These allegorical texts functioned as maps of interior transformation, encoding in symbol and story what cannot be adequately conveyed through direct philosophical exposition. The mentality required of the true adept differs radically from both the religious believer and the scientific materialist. Unlike the believer, the occult practitioner cannot rest in faith or defer to external authority. Unlike the materialist, they cannot dismiss interior experience as mere epiphenomena of brain chemistry. The adept must cultivate what the British occultist Dion Fortune called the trained will and sanctified imagination, the capacity to engage psychological and spiritual realities with full intensity while maintaining critical discernment. This requires radical intellectual honesty, the willingness to question every assumption, and the courage to proceed despite uncertainty. The ethical dimension of this work cannot be understated. Shadow integration is not morally neutral self-exploration. It demands that we take responsibility for aspects of ourselves we would prefer to project onto others. It requires that we acknowledge the capacity for cruelty, deception, cowardice, and destructiveness within our own nature. This acknowledgement does not excuse harmful behavior, but rather makes genuine ethical choice possible for the first time. Only when we cease to imagine ourselves as fundamentally good people, occasionally making mistakes, can we begin to make conscious, responsible decisions about how we will act in the world. The shadow work unfolds through a series of definite stages, each with its own psychological character, symbolic correspondence, and existential crisis. These stages are not arbitrary divisions imposed by theory, but rather represent organic phases that emerge from the nature of the psyche itself when it undertakes comprehensive self-examination. The journey begins with the shattering recognition that we systematically project our own rejected qualities onto others. This projection mechanism operates automatically and unconsciously. The qualities we most vehemently criticize in others, their selfishness, their laziness, their dishonesty, their weakness, invariably point to aspects of ourselves we have refused to acknowledge. Jung observed that we can recognize our shadow most clearly by examining what triggers disproportionate emotional reactions. When we experience rage, contempt, or intense disgust toward another person, we encounter our own shadow material being reflected back to us through the mirror of the other. This recognition phase does not happen once and for all, but must be practiced repeatedly as a discipline of attention. The work involves catching oneself in the act of judgment, pausing, and asking with ruthless honesty, what aspect of myself am I refusing to see? This question must be pursued even when, especially when, we feel most certain of the other person's obvious flaws. The more convinced we are that our negative assessment of another is objectively accurate, the more likely we are encountering a projection of our own shadow. Psychologically, this stage activates tremendous resistance because the ego structure depends upon maintaining its self-image. The ego would rather defend its coherence than acknowledge contradiction. This is why projection feels so psychologically necessary. It allows us to maintain our self-concept as reasonable, moral, and self-aware, while simultaneously disposing of incompatible qualities by locating them out there in others. Once projection has been recognized intellectually, the actual descent begins. This is not a metaphorical descent, but an experiential immersion into psychological material that the conscious mind finds deeply threatening. In Jungian terms, this constitutes active engagement with unconscious contents through techniques such as active imagination, dream work, and careful attention to affective states. The experience of this descent often manifests as intrusive thoughts, disturbing dreams, sudden emotional storms, and the emergence of impulses we believed ourselves incapable of experiencing. A person who identifies as gentle and kind may encounter violent fantasies. Someone who prides themselves on independence may discover desperate neediness. The intellectual who lives in abstraction confronts raw, inarticulate emotion. The emotional person discovers cold, calculating rationality. This stage corresponds to the alchemical Nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the encounter with death and decay. The alchemists understood that before any transformation could occur, the prima materia, the initial substance, had to be reduced to its most basic state, broken down completely. Applied psychologically, this means the dissolution of the ego's carefully constructed self-image. The persona, that socially acceptable mask, begins to crack and fragment under the pressure of shadow material that will no longer be contained. The archetypal dimension of this encounter involves what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow figure. This often appears in dreams or active imagination as a person of the same sex as the dreamer, possessing qualities that disturb or frighten the ego consciousness. This figure is not merely a symbol, but a psychological reality, an autonomous complex with its own energy, agenda, and intelligence. The shadow figure often speaks truths the ego does not want to hear, reveals motivations the conscious mind would prefer to keep hidden, and demands recognition and integration. The temptation at this stage is to pathologize what is being encountered, to interpret these disturbing contents as evidence of mental illness, requiring suppression through medication or cognitive management. But the esoteric understanding recognizes this upheaval as necessary and ultimately healing. The symptoms are not the disease, but the cure beginning to work. The psyche's attempt to restore wholeness by forcing rejected material back into awareness. The third stage involves establishing a conscious relationship with shadow contents rather than being overwhelmed by them or immediately repressing them again. This requires the cultivation of what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold the tension between conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, without premature resolution into one pole or the other. Active imagination serves as the primary technique for this dialogue. The practitioner enters a light trance state, allows a shadow figure to emerge in imagination, and then engages it in genuine conversation. This is not mere fantasy or creative writing. It requires that the ego consciousness maintain its integrity while allowing the autonomous complex to express itself without censorship. The shadow figure is given space to speak its grievances, articulate its needs, and reveal the perspective that has been excluded from conscious awareness. This process of differentiation clarifies that the shadow is not monolithic. It contains multiple layers and levels. There is the personal shadow, the qualities we personally have rejected based on family conditioning and social learning. There is the cultural shadow, the collective repressions of our society, the capacities and qualities our civilization has systematically devalued. And there is what Jung called the archetypal shadow, the universal human capacity for evil, destruction, and chaos that exists as a potential in every individual, regardless of personal history. The differentiation process also reveals that the shadow contains not only negative qualities, but also positive potentials we have failed to develop. The person raised in a harsh, critical environment may have repressed their capacity for joy and playfulness. The individual trained in emotional restraint may have buried their capacity for passionate engagement. The shadow thus becomes a source of vitality and creativity once its contents are consciously accessed rather than unconsciously acted out. Symbolically, this stage corresponds to the alchemical albedo, the whitening, the clarification, the emergence of structure from chaos. The dissolved material from the Nigredo begins to crystallize into new forms. The psychological disorientation of the descent gives way to moments of startling clarity about one's own nature, motivations, and patterns. The fourth stage involves the actual integration of shadow material into conscious personality. This does not mean acting out every repressed impulse. Integration is not about behavioral expression, but about conscious acknowledgement and containment. When we integrate a shadow quality, we accept it as part of our nature, without necessarily expressing it in action. For example, integrating shadow aggression does not require becoming violent. It means acknowledging the capacity for aggression within oneself, understanding the legitimate functions of assertive energy, and consciously choosing when and how to express appropriate boundary setting, self-defense, or forceful action. The integrated person can access their aggressive potential when necessary, without being unconsciously driven by it or projecting it onto others. This integration fundamentally alters the ego structure. The ego can no longer maintain its innocent self-image. It must expand to accommodate contradictory qualities. The person who integrates their shadow becomes psychologically more complex, more nuanced, and paradoxically more humble. They lose the certainty of moral superiority because they recognize the potential for both creation and destruction within themselves. Jung described this as the emergence of the individuated personality, the person who has differentiated themselves from both collective values and unconscious compulsions, who has achieved a degree of psychological sovereignty. This individual acts from conscious choice rather than conditioning, can hold ambiguity without anxiety, and demonstrates what Jung called moral flexibility, the capacity to respond appropriately to specific situations rather than rigidly applying abstract principles. The alchemical correspondence here is the rubedo, the reddening, the completion of the work, the emergence of the philosopher's stone. The base metal of unconscious personality has been transformed into the gold of conscious, integrated selfhood. But this is not a final state. It is an achievement that must be maintained through ongoing practice, as new shadow material continuously emerges throughout life. A final dimension of this work involves recognizing the collective shadow, the repressed aspects of the culture and civilization we inhabit. Every society defines acceptable and unacceptable qualities, and systematically represses what it deems threatening to social cohesion. In contemporary Western culture, we have collectively repressed many aspects of the erotic, the tragic, the irrational, and the sacred. These repressions do not eliminate the realities they deny, but drive them underground, where they erupt in distorted forms, in violence, addiction, fundamentalism, and collective delusion. The individuated person must confront not only their personal shadow, but also the shadow of their culture. This requires the courage to question collective values, to stand apart from social consensus when necessary, and to embody qualities the culture has rejected. This is dangerous work, as cultures protect their repressions aggressively and punish those who make the invisible visible. The most profound crisis in shadow work arrives when the practitioner realizes that the integration of shadow material does not lead to resolution, but to a more fundamental confrontation with the existential groundlessness of identity itself. This is the dark night that mystics have described across traditions, the moment when all previous frameworks collapse and the seeker finds themselves suspended in a void without meaning, purpose, or direction. This crisis differs essentially from clinical depression or pathological anxiety. It is not a failure of the process, but its fulfillment, the necessary consequence of genuinely seeing through the illusions that structure ordinary consciousness. The practitioner discovers that there is no solid self to be integrated, no final synthesis that will resolve all contradictions, no achievement that will provide lasting security. The ego desperately seeks some compensatory reward for its difficult work, increased power, spiritual attainment, psychological stability, and instead encounters only the dissolution of the ground upon which all such ambitions rest. The alchemical texts prepare the adept for this moment through the symbolism of death and mortification. The practitioners depicted in these texts do not simply improve themselves, they die. Their former identity is annihilated. The Nigredo is not merely psychological discomfort, but genuine ego death, the absolute collapse of all reference points. Modern psychology often tries to sanitize this experience, to manage it therapeutically, to ensure the ego emerges intact on the other side. But the esoteric tradition insists that no genuine transformation occurs without the complete breaking of the previous container. Jung himself experienced this crisis in his midlife, a period he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. For several years he was flooded with visions, overwhelmed by archetypal material, unable to function professionally with full capacity. He recorded these experiences in what became the Red Book, a text he kept private for decades, because it documented a process that exceeded the boundaries of conventional psychology. What emerges from Jung's account is that this crisis was not a breakdown to be overcome, but an initiation to be endured and integrated, a death from which a new mode of consciousness could emerge. The philosophical dimension of this crisis centers on the problem of meaning. The shadow work reveals that all our previous sources of meaning, our identities, our achievements, our relationships, our beliefs, rest upon unconscious psychological mechanisms. We discover that we have been living according to scripts we did not write, pursuing goals we did not consciously choose, defending values we inherited unconsciously. The recognition that even our most cherished commitments may be shadow formations, unconscious compensations for repressed complexes, creates a vertiginous sense of meaninglessness. This is where authentic nihilism arises, not as an intellectual position, but as a lived reality. The practitioner cannot return to naive belief in external meaning-giving structures, religion, ideology, social role, because they have seen through their psychological foundation. Yet they have not yet achieved the capacity to generate meaning consciously and authentically from their own depths. They inhabit a transitional state of suspension, what the mystics called the cloud of unknowing, or the desert of the divine. The temptation at this stage is either regression or spiritual bypassing. Regression involves retreating to previous certainties, abandoning the work, and reconstructing the ego defenses that have been dismantled. Spiritual bypassing involves leaping prematurely to transcendent meaning, adopting religious or spiritual frameworks that provide comfort without demanding genuine transformation. Both responses constitute failures of nerve, refusals to remain in the crisis until it completes its work. The authentic response requires what the existentialists called the courage to be, the capacity to persist in existence without external justification or guaranteed meaning. This is not stoicism or grim endurance, but rather a different quality of presence, a willingness to be with what is without demanding that it be otherwise. In this suspension, a strange possibility emerges, not a new belief system or identity structure, but a capacity to exist consciously without such structures, to act meaningfully while acknowledging the groundlessness of all action. Jung understood this crisis as teleological. It exists not as punishment or obstacle, but as necessary preparation for genuine individuation. The person who has not passed through this dark night remains identified with ego consciousness, vulnerable to inflation, and liable to project their unlived life onto others or onto collective movements. Only the person who has experienced the dissolution of all reference points can begin to build a conscious relationship with the self, understood not as a larger ego, but as the organizing principle that transcends and includes both conscious and unconscious dimensions of the personality. The difference between this esoteric crisis and modern pathology lies in its intentionality and context. The person undergoing spiritual crisis has consciously chosen to engage in psychological work, possesses conceptual frameworks to understand the process, and ideally maintains connection with a tradition or teacher who can confirm that what they are experiencing is part of the path rather than a deviation from it. The person suffering from uncontained psychosis or severe depression has none of these supports. They are overwhelmed by unconscious material without the ego strength to process it or the conceptual tools to understand it. Nevertheless, the distinction remains porous. The initiatory crisis can become genuine breakdown if the practitioner lacks sufficient ego development, adequate external support, or the capacity to metabolize the material that emerges. This is why the esoteric traditions always insisted on preparation, gradual development, and the guidance of those who have completed the journey. The modern tendency to democratize spiritual practice, to treat powerful techniques as consumer goods available to anyone at any time, ignores these dangers and often produces casualties rather than adepts. The goal of shadow integration is not the attainment of perfection, but the achievement of wholeness, a crucial distinction. Perfection implies the elimination of all negative qualities, the purification of the personality until only desirable attributes remain. Wholeness implies the conscious inclusion of all aspects of the personality, both light and dark, into a more comprehensive center of awareness and agency. This wholeness manifests as what Jung called the individuated personality, the person who has differentiated themselves from both collective conditioning and unconscious compulsion. Such an individual possesses several distinctive qualities. First, they demonstrate remarkable psychological stability, not because they lack problems or challenges, but because they have developed the capacity to contain and process psychological material without being overwhelmed by it. They can experience intense emotions without being identified with them, can observe their own psychological patterns without being enslaved by them. Second, the individuated person exhibits genuine ethical autonomy. This is not the autonomy of the ego that imagines itself self-made and self-sufficient, but rather the autonomy that emerges from having confronted one's own capacity for evil and chosen consciously not to enact it. Such a person cannot be easily manipulated by collective movements or ideological certainties because they have seen through the psychological mechanisms that drive such phenomena. They act from conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. Third, they possess what the alchemists called the philosopher's stone, the capacity to transform psychological lead into gold, to metabolize suffering and confusion into wisdom and compassion. This is not an abstract capability, but a practical skill that manifests in how they engage with their own pain and the pain of others. They no longer require that reality conform to their preferences in order to remain psychologically intact. They have developed the capacity to work with whatever arises. The practical applications of this transformation appear in every domain of life. In relationships, the individuated person no longer requires their partner to carry their projected shadow material. They can see the other person as they actually are, rather than as a screen for their own unconscious contents. This makes genuine intimacy possible for the first time, as intimacy requires the capacity to be with another person in their otherness, rather than using them to complete one's own psychology. In creative work, access to shadow material provides tremendous vitality and depth. The artist or thinker who has integrated their shadow can draw upon the full spectrum of human experience: rage and tenderness, cruelty and compassion, destruction and creation. Their work possesses authenticity because it emerges from wholeness rather than from a sanitized, socially acceptable self-presentation. In leadership and teaching, the individuated person exercises authority without authoritarianism, maintains boundaries without rigidity, and demonstrates genuine care without codependent enabling. They have confronted their own capacity for misuse of power and chosen consciously to wield influence responsibly. They do not require their students or followers to idealize them because they have no investment in maintaining an inflated self-image. Most significantly, the individuated person develops what Jung called the moral imagination, the capacity to respond appropriately to complex situations that cannot be resolved through the application of abstract principles. They understand that genuine ethics requires flexibility, contextual awareness, and the willingness to bear the burden of ambiguity. They know that the right action in one situation may be the wrong action in another, and they have developed the judgment to discern the difference. This ethical capacity extends to a recognition of one's responsibility not only for personal actions, but for collective participation. The person who has integrated their shadow cannot avoid recognizing how they contribute to the shadow of their culture, how their consumption patterns support exploitation, how their silence enables injustice, how their comfortable assumptions perpetuate suffering. This recognition does not lead to paralysis or guilt, but to conscious engagement with collective problems from a foundation of personal integration. The discipline practiced within the Hermetic school provides essential support for this work. The school offers not techniques to be consumed, but a context within which genuine transformation can occur, a community of practitioners engaged in the same work, theoretical frameworks to understand the process, and connection to a lineage that has preserved this knowledge across generations. Without such support, the practitioner risks either abandoning the work when it becomes difficult or mistaking preliminary insights for final attainment. The philosophy underlying this approach insists that wisdom cannot be transmitted directly, but must be earned through ordeal. The school does not offer comfort or easy answers, but rather provides maps of territory that each individual must traverse themselves. It maintains the standards and rigor that the contemporary spiritual marketplace has largely abandoned in favor of accessible, consumable content that requires no genuine sacrifice or transformation. The confrontation with the shadow remains the essential initiation into authentic self-knowledge, the threshold that cannot be avoided by those who seek truth rather than comfort. Every esoteric tradition, every genuine psychology, every meaningful philosophy converges on this recognition. Transformation demands dissent, wisdom requires wounding, and the gold you seek cannot be found until you have had the courage to enter your own darkness and claim what you find there as your own. The philosopher's stone is not discovered in external substances or transcendent realms. It is forged in the crucible of consciousness that has learned to contain both the heights of aspiration and the depths of despair without being destroyed by either.